Hey guys, it's Brandon. Welcome to another edition of the Master Game. I haven't done one of these in a while, and I decided it's time to look at a game. This game that I'm going to feature today was played in 1990 in the World Championship match between Garry Kasparov and Anatoly Karpov. And this is one of probably the most memorable and exciting games from that event. So I'll just give you a brief history of the event. This was the fourth or the third rematch between Garry Kasparov and Anatoly Karpov for the world title. Going into the this match, which took place the first 12 games in New York and the second 12 games in Lyon, and Kasparov was coming into this game with an insanely high rating for 1990 of 2,800. 2,800 in the year 1990, accounting for, there's only 3 players or so in the world right now, maybe even only 2 that have a 2,800 rating. So, counting in 23 years of ratings inflation, 2,800 is like, it's 2,900 plus nowadays. But so that was Kasparov's rating, and Anatoly Karpov was probably by far the most second highest rated player in the world at 2,730. Just to give you a comparison, 2,730 would put him probably today in the ratings somewhere in the mid-20s of the highest rated players in the world. So this game is game number 20, and the score in the match was, I believe Kasparov was leading by 1 game. And Kasparov here played some real power chess. This was a real exciting game, and there's a lot of possible variations. And I'll try not to bog you down with too many possible variations, but some of them are so fun. So much fun to see that you just sort of have to show them. So I'll try to get through the opening a little bit quicker than I might normally. So this was Kasparov playing white, and he had e4. This was his one of his favorite opening moves. It's definitely the favorite of his youth. Later on in his career, he played a little more d4, but Karpov played e5, which was his favorite defense against d4, and we got a Roy Lopez. And the specific variation we get is the closed Roy Lopez. So this is all standard here, h3. And Karpov plays bishop b7. This move is called the Zaitsev variation, which sort of, I guess, is less common these days, mostly because of how Garry Kasparov picked apart the Zaitsev variation against Karpov in some of these world championships. I think he had a lot of good wins, including this game against the Zaitsev. Some other possibilities here for black are the standard Chigorin defense, attacking this bishop, and then when the bishop retreats to play c5, and then white usually plays d4. There's the Breyer defense, which is where the knight goes back and then quickly comes here to d5 to b7, d7, and then black plays for c5 later. What other variations are there here? There's the Smyslov, which is just to play h6, which is a quiet defense, and Kasparov played this Smyslov defense against deep blue in Game 2 of the 1997 World Championship. There's a few other less played variations, like the Kirez, I think, is like knight to d7 or something here, but bishop b7 is what Karpov was playing at the time, and Kasparov just goes for standard d4, grabbing the center, developing the knight, and a4. This is a very common move in almost all closed Roy Lopez variations. White's arguing that black has put these pawns on a6 and b5, and they could be attacked by this pawn. And the other idea is, in some cases, and like we will see in this game, the rook can come to a3 and possibly swing across to the king side. So we actually see that happening in this game. But Karpov starts out with h6, just a safety move, and bishop c2, so getting the bishop to overprotect this e4 pawn. And now we see Karpov make a decision here, which not all players necessarily like. It's a tough decision to have to make. He plays e takes d4 and gives up the center and gives white these 2 pawns in the center. But what he's hoping for is that he can get pressure on the center via this bishop and this knight, and then he's also noting that having played a4 and now taking with this pawn, this knight can come into the b4 square. and possibly have a nice square on b4. So it's sort of risky though, because you're giving Kasparov the chance at some point maybe to push the center forward and open up some of his pieces, and just giving white the pawns there. So black sort of has to play actively and aggressively here. He goes in with knight b4, trying to snag that light square bishop, which is a very valuable piece for white in this case, in these types of positions. So Kasparov just plays bishop to b1, not interested in giving up that light square bishop. And you might argue that, okay, this is a hole in black's position, and after c5, which is the move Karpov played, the knight is protected on c5, and you could argue that that knight is well placed. It's controlling a lot of light squares that white might like to maybe develop his queen at some point. So Karpov's position is probably okay here, but let's see what happens in the rest of the game. Kasparov actually decides to close the position by playing d5, rather than allowing the center to be taken and traded off and stuff like that. He decides to play d5, shutting down this bishop and gaining a little bit of space in the center. So Karpov plays knight d7 with the idea that the knight maybe can come into e5 at some point. Maybe after a move like c4, the knight can jump into the c5 square. So it's a flexible move. And after rook a3, as mentioned earlier, the rook maneuver now, the rook has a lot of space and can possibly, and we will see that he will come over to the king side with some real nice effect. And now here, Karpov plays a very double-edged move. He plays the move f5, which looks like it makes a lot of sense in the sense that you're attacking the center. You're attacking the e4 pawn, and then if the e4 pawn gets taken, this pawn on d5 becomes weak. But there is a cost to playing this move f5, and it's that he's opening up his king a little bit, and specifically a lot of these light squares are around the king become a lot weaker. Having already played this move h6 before, there's a lot of weaknesses around the king, and you might say, well, okay, black has this light square bishop, but the light square bishop is nowhere near any of these light squares. You can't really get back there quickly, so there's possibly an opportunity for Kasparov to take advantage of this. So he plays rook e3, knight f6, just putting more pressure on this pawn. And Kasparov decided here to play knight to h2. And the idea of this move being that if black ever takes the pawn on e4, he may in the future have a move like knight g4 coming in and putting pressure on the black king side. So king h8 was played, just a waiting move, a safety move, trying to get off of some of these light squares by Karpov. And Kasparov played the move b3. And so now he's protecting the a-pawn, but more importantly, has found a good role for this bishop, which has been sitting here on b2 undeveloped and is totally blocked here. A lot of the moves that Karpov has played, this taking in the center and allowing the d5 push, is now allowing the bishop to be put on this very nice open diagonal pointing straight at the king. So we're starting to see some, after the capture in c4 and bishop b2, we're starting to see the beginnings of what could be a very dangerous position for Karpov, with these two bishops bearing down on the king side. The rook has chances to come in here. You can see if the knight ever moves, the queen could have some of these nice light squares to come in on. The knight can jump into g4, so there's a lot of possibilities. The king could be in a lot of trouble if Karpov doesn't play very precisely. And he decided now to go in here and take on e4. After knight takes e4, he grabbed this pawn in the center. Knight f takes d5. So he's up a pawn here, but at what cost? Having taken all of those pawns just totally opens up both of the bishops pointing at the king, and things become very dangerous very quickly. So he plays the move rook g3, and now a good safety move here by Karpov, rook to e6, defending some squares here, protecting this this h6 pawn, because he could see a possibility of knight g4 coming in, and then the pawn would be under attack because of this bishop pinning the pawn here. So now Kasparov did play knight g4, and here Karpov made the final, not the final mistake, but is a real move that sort of was a little bit like waving the red cloth at the bull here to Kasparov, which he took advantage of. He played this move queen to e8, which sort of looks like a nice move because it's guarding some light squares, but Kasparov just decided that it was go time here, and he played the move knight takes h6. So taking advantage of the pin on the g-pawn so that the pawn can't take. So the first question that you want to ask yourself is, this isn't what Karpov played, but what if Karpov just simply takes that knight? Okay, he's got a rook. Well, there's a follow-up move here which is devastating for white, and that's knight takes d6, uncovering an attack on the queen with two pieces. So the queen has to move, you would think. So let's try out a few possibilities for where the queen can move. The knight is also attacking this undefended bishop on b7. So let's say the queen decides to protect the bishop. This gets punished immediately by knight to f7 check, king moves, knight h6 check, and then there's a pawn on the pawn is pinned by the rook, so the king has no other move. He has to go back to h8. Again, this square being covered by these beautiful long-range bishops here, just raking the king side. Now after queen h5, there's no way to defend against the threat of the double check here on knight f7 check. So, for example, if black tries to trade queens, knight f7 check, king to g8, and bishop h7 is mate. So moving the queen to b8 to try to save the bishop is not an option. So let's say, let's try after knight to d6, let's try queen h5. Looks logical, attempting to exchange the queens and argue that white can have this bishop back, and I'll try to hang on to my position this way. But after this move, there's a killer tactical move here that I wouldn't have seen, and the computer finds it immediately. But go ahead and pause the video if you don't know the game, and take a couple seconds to try to see what the tactical shot here in the position is. And that shot is rook to g5. So sacrificing a rook. So what happens if you have to yourself? What happens if the queen takes on g5? Just takes that rook and says thanks for the rook. Well, it's just knight f7 check, winning the queen. So that's not an option. And what if the queen decides to give itself just okay? You're going to attack my queen. I'll just trade queens. Let's see what happens here. After knight f7 check, king comes to g8. Knight takes check again with the pin, and now comes the queen take, and still the pawn is pinned by the bishop now, so it can't retake the knight. So let's say black tries to block out that bishop. There's a really cool sequence here where white can play knight f7 check, king to g8, and now just totally ignore this bishop on b2 and play bishop g6. The point being that if black plays pawn takes g2, there's now rook to h5, and there's absolutely no defense to the rook coming here onto h5 onto h8 and checkmating the king. So that's what happens in that case. And now the final case is what happens after rook to g5 is what if black plays queen h4. Just, alright, I'll just move out of the way. I'm not going to fall for any of those tactics. I'm just going to move out of the way. But still, the point being, the queen is no longer covering the f7 square. So the knight comes in and takes here. And if the queen takes, there's rook h5 and attacking the queen, being protected by the queen here on d1. And if the queen tries to move away, then there's bishop to b7 check, or bishop to h7 check. And if the king goes to f7, there's rook f5 check. And now notice the rook is cut here, another attacking piece. but in the sense that it's cutting the king off from escaping. So there's no move for the king at all here. So he has to end up blocking with the queen, and then after this, the queen sneaks in on h5, and shortly checkmate follows. And if after bishop h7, the king goes to h8, then we get bishop g6 check, king g8, and now pause the video and work on your tactical skills here. How does white finish the king off here? He plays rook h8 check, forcing the king to take, which gives him time to get the queen in for the nice checkmate on h7. So, after knight takes d6, then, you're probably wondering, if we go back to the position here, I'll just get rid of some of these arrows, what happens if black just takes that, just says, okay, you can take that pawn, but I'll take your knight, and then when you take my queen, I'll take the rook, and I'll have a nice material advantage here, or at least a workable material advantage. He's got a rook and 2 pieces for the queen in this situation. But thanks to the power of those awesome bishops and the openness created of by black's king, it's still losing. After queen to h5 check, king to g8, bishop h7 check, the king has nowhere to go, he has to come to h8, and then bishop g6 check, discovered check, king comes here, and then we see the queen to h7 mate coming in. So Karpov, after knight takes h6, probably seeing all these variations and saying, I don't want to deal with any of that, tried the move c3, hoping to at least block off one of these bishops in the attack. And Kasparov said, okay, you can have that bishop. I'm going to play knight back to f5. I'm going to have some squares for my queen to penetrate on. And Karpov, well, I said, okay, I might as well try and take that bishop. So now came queen g4, and the threat is to play queen check on h4, and things are getting real shaky for the black king. Karpov tried bishop c8, now queen h4 came in, and after rook h6, Karpov is trying to give away some material to sort of lessen the attack, but it's really not enough. King to h2. This is a really nice finesse move. King h2 is played in this case because the knight on e4 is actually pinned. It's pinned to the rook, but now, or in this position, say, it's pinned to the rook and can't move because the rook will fall with check. So now Kasparov just plays king to h2, giving himself the opportunity to move the knight, and even though the rook is hanging, it's not hanging with check. So he'll have time to sort of drum up some mate, or attempt to drum up a mate, even if that rook falls. So Karpov here tried queen e5, centralizing the queen and pinning the rook to the king, and but then after knight g5, queen f6, Kasparov comes up with the devastating rook to e8. So pinning this bishop, making all kinds of threats. Let's take a look at some of them. Let's say Karpov tries to get out of this pin and try this bishop to b7, so that if rook takes rook, bishop takes rook. Well, then Kasparov can play queen takes h6 check, taking advantage of the pin here. And if queen takes h6, knight f7 is actually checkmate, the rook cutting the king off, the bishop cutting off this square, and the knight delivering the check. So that doesn't really work. So Karpov tried after rook e8, bishop f5. And here Kasparov actually misses an easy a forcing checkmate. He could have played in this. What he did play was queen to h6. What he could have played was knight to f7 check. The idea being that it's a discovered attack on the queen. So if the king moves to h7, then we just take the queen, and then there's no way to stop this checkmate here. And after knight f7 check, if queen takes f7, then there's queen h6 check, taking advantage of the fact that this bishop is still pinned. And then bishop h7 to block is followed up with rook takes h8, and then there's no way to stop the rook from taking here, and the king is just getting massacred in this position. So check, queen takes, this is all just forcing, and it's checkmate here. So Kasparov missed that. Instead of after bishop f5, he played queen takes h6 check, and after queen takes h6, the knight f7 check came in, king h7, bishop takes f5 check. Notice he's not being impatient. He's not just taking back his material right away. He's going to take the bishop first because the queen is still hanging. The king has nowhere to go, so he has to interpose with the queen. And here he played bishop h6 check, and after king g7, rook takes a8. Karpov's position is Karpov's position is just crumbling. The bishop still is guarding the b1 square, so even the passed pawn is not so dangerous at this point. And what's black to do here? He tried bishop e7, and after rook b8, a5, bishop e4, check, discovered check, and then bishop takes d5 check. Karpov resigned because of if knight takes d5, for example, then the rook takes down here, and there's 2 exchanges and 2 pawns up is way more than enough, especially considering these pawns are just going to run down the board. So that's how the game ended. I'll show you one final variation that Kasparov himself missed, and in his excitement just to take all of Karpov's pieces. Instead of playing bishop takes g6 here, he had the opportunity to play rook takes g6. And the killer point of this move is that white is actually threatening mate in 1. He's threatening just to move the rook back, and then that would be checkmate against the king. So, for example, here, this is just checkmate. Nowhere for the king to go. The only real possibility for black to attempt to defend would be to play queen here, but then bishop takes, and it's still renewing the threat of that checkmate. So if he tries to block that threat, you can just take the bishop, or to take the knight, or you can play rook g3, just attacking the pinned knight, and still still threatening that. So if the rook takes, then there's bishop d3 check, and then mate. Or if the knight tries to protect that knight, then there's rook takes a8. And what's there even to do? I mean, black can't even move anything. He can't even move this bishop, because if this bishop moves, then the rook comes here to h8 and takes the checkmate there. So this bishop is falling. These knights are falling. Everything is just falling here, and there's just nothing to do. So a real beatdown, a real powerhouse game by Kasparov versus Karpov. So we'll just go run through a quick summary here. This was a Roy Lopez, and some of the key moments as I see them are this decision to open up the center, and so not necessarily a bad decision, but black sort of went wrong here in the long run, giving white and playing f5, opening up the king, creating some weak light squares around the king when the bishop was pretty far away from defending those light squares. It had its points. He was attacking the center, and Karpov really needed to win the game. He was behind the game, so he went to try to win the game. And now this bishop coming here to b2 and further opening up the center, just giving these bishops a real opportunity to attack on the king side. And after queen to e8, that was the final move that sealed his fate, because knight takes h6 is nearly impossible to defend against. Karpov tried c3, but knight f5, giving up the bishop, but getting the queen into the game. And this nice move, king h2, just taking advantage of the fact that the knight can now move without the rook hanging with check. So queen e5, knight to g5. By the way, if the queen now takes the rook, we have knight f7 checkmate. So that's actually an illustration of why the rook not falling with check was a good move. So knight g5, Karpov trying queen f6, pinning the knight, but now rook e8 was the final sort of nail in the coffin. And after bishop f5, Kasparov missed some nice wins, but this was well more than enough for in order for Kasparov to win the game. So this game gave him a 2-point lead in the match. which Karpov eventually won one more game, but Kasparov managed to hold on to the world title, winning by one game, and this victory was probably a big reason why. So hope you guys enjoyed that game and the commentary, and we will see you next time.